All right, 25 minutes before 10 o'clock. Robin, what do I always say is my favorite type of book?
Oh, history.
Biography.
Love history. Biography.
I love biographies. And the reason I love biographies is because they give us some inside information as to how a person who is worthy of having a biography written about him or her,
exactly,
how they were able to do what they did. And almost inevitably, they always have, well, and I'm not talking about, the biography of a murderer or something like that, but I mean, biographies of great people always have these amazing stories of having not been born into great wealth and having had their own share of hardships and how they overcame them. And maybe the reason I like biographies so much is because they give us all a sense, especially in America. Especially in America, you could have somebody in a poor situation in a country that doesn't offer any opportunities, and the same results won't happen. But in this land of opportunity, not to be cliche-ish, but we have some great stories. One I had never heard before was the story of George Romney.
Yes.
How did I learn about him? From Patrick Foster. He's on the phone. He wrote the book called George Romney and American Life, and I can't wait to share it with you. Patrick Foster is one of America's best-known auto journalists. He's an historian. He's a feature writer. He has a regular column in Classic Car and Old Cars Weekly, and he's written an amazing biography about George Romney. Let's talk to Patrick right now. Good morning, Patrick.
Good morning. You're going to turn my head with that. It's too much flattery.
Oh my gosh! Well, I love biography. You know what? I never knew anything about George Romney. Where are you calling from, first of all?
I'm calling from Connecticut.
Oh, okay, Connecticut. And so, have you always been a fan of George Romney? I mean, I'm guessing you are.
I'm a fan now, but the way it came about, the first book I wrote was a history of the American Motors Corporation. And that was a car company that should have gone out of business in 1954.
Is that Rambler?
But it had this, exactly, the Rambler. It had this dynamic new CEO that had just come on board, and through sheer force of will and leadership, he turned the company around and made it into a blockbuster. Really, it was the only competition the big three automakers ever had was the Rambler. It zoomed up to third place for a while in industry sales. And I thought, what an amazing thing. And I had read an article about this man, George Romney, and it gave some indication of his life story as being very, very interesting. And so I made arrangements to meet him and interview him for the book I was working on then. And out of that, I said, someday I've got to write a biography of George. Now, of course, in the interim, his son, Mitt, has become quite a famous personality, too.
Right. So we know the name because of Mitt, but this is this is like, who's the patriarch of the Kennedy family? This is like the patriarch.
Joe Kennedy?
Yeah.
Yes. But quite a different story.
I think so, yeah. George, I was going to say, I don't want to compare the two, except for the fact
George Romney George was born in Mexico, and his family was forced out of Mexico when he was just 5 years old. They were forced out at gunpoint by Mexican revolutionaries who were taking over the colony, the Mormon colony that they lived in northern Mexico. And they had to flee to Texas. And when George was just 5 years old, he was living in a donated army tent that the U.S. government sent down. A tent. They set up a tent city for these Mormon refugees.
Wow.
And as he recalled later on, he said, we were really the first displaced people of the 20th century. And from there, his family went from one letdown to another. They bought a farm in Idaho that failed, and his father went bust a number of times. One interesting story he told me with this farm that they had in Idaho. Of course, they grew potatoes, and there was no rail transportation to move the potatoes to market, so they ended up living on potatoes for a year. They ate nothing but potatoes for a solid year. They had potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and when he told me that story, he had a smile on his face like it was a fond memory. And I said, George, didn't you ever get discouraged? Didn't you ever get a chip on your shoulder like, hey, life is being really unfair? And he looked at me in wonderment, and he said, no. He said, this is America. I knew that there were opportunities out there for me.
Did he see his...
I thought, what an amazing person to say that.
Did he learn that from his father's failures. I know that almost sounds like it's illogical, but do you think so? I mean, it sounds like he witnessed his father at least trying. You couldn't even try in some other countries.
Yes, yeah. And what he said is his father always managed to roll with the punches. He never got discouraged, and George never got discouraged. And, you know, when you think of so many people, you read in the papers of these young criminals, well, they had a hard life, and this is why they turned to crime. Well, here's a guy who had a very hard life. He lived in poverty most of his youth, and he ended up he pulled himself up literally by the bootstraps.
I love this story. I love his story. Did the religious part of his convictions affect his business life?
I think it led or it influenced his business life greatly because he was a very moral person. He was honest. He was one of these automotive businessmen who was, as honest as anybody could be, and he dealt fairly with everybody. And I think that's, in this cynical world that we live in, I saw this guy who is a great moral leader, great political leader, great business leader, and didn't have any skeletons in the closet, which And I thought this is something that people in America have to read about.
When you see the name Romney,
you can really
not to compare it to Kennedy again, but when you see those two names, you think born with a silver spoon. You see the name Trump, born with a silver spoon. Mm-hmm. George was not, clearly. I mean, you've already established that. Mitt was, though. However, is that fair to say?
I don't know if I'd put it in quite those words, but he was born into an advantaged family. His parents were well-to-do. Mitt went to the better schools. His story is very much different from his father's. But in a lot of ways, they're very similar people. And when I was interviewing George for this book, I would visit him sometimes over at Mitt's house. And to see the interaction between the two, it was really nice. They had a great father-son relationship. And I think there is a lot of George Romney and Mitt Romney, though they are different people.
So when they were living in Mexico, were they citizens of Mexico? And then when they came over here, they received their U.S. citizenship, or were they Americans living in Mexico?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. That's an interesting point. We've heard the term Mexican Americans. Mm-hmm. George Romney was an American Mexican. He was an American citizen living in Mexico. His parents had been born in America. They moved to this Mormon colony in northern, or actually his grandparents moved to this Mormon colony, in Mexico, and his parents were American born. And so he was a natural American citizen. If you're born to American citizens, you're a natural American citizen. When they moved to Texas, in their flight to Texas, the U.S. government didn't require anybody to be naturalized because they were already American citizens. Mm-hmm. No, they were Americans living in Mexico. George spoke. He was bilingual. He spoke Spanish and English.
When did he run for the presidency?
That was for the 68 presidency, so in 67. Okay. And he was the front runner for quite a while. He had a good story. And one thing that I really like about him, he was a Republican who ran against the war in Vietnam. He had initially been for it. He went on a fact-finding trip to Vietnam, and he came back and he said, we've been lied to by the military. We are not winning this war, and we're just supporting a corrupt government. It's time for us to get out of there.
Really? Oh, my God.
He caught, he caught a firestorm over that. People, said that he was two-faced, he was turning around his platform, but he had learned by going over there that, for all the body counts that the military was saying, that's how they used to tell us that we were winning in Vietnam. They'd say, well, we killed 600 Viet Cong yesterday, and 500 this morning, and things like that. What they didn't tell us is we weren't winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. George saw that, and he came out against the war, and he paid a heavy price for it. And what really killed his candidacy is the way he explained it. He was on a talk show, a television talk show, And he said, I've just got back from Vietnam, and the military over there really brainwashed me about this war, and they did a very thorough job. And the media picked up, people like you and me, on that one term, brainwashing, and they made it a joke.
Oh yeah, the clean. It must have a clean brain. Oh, wait, what is it? He keeps changing it so much, or something like that. What was this?
Yeah, his brain must be clean because he keeps changing it so often.
Yeah, right.
You know, yeah. He became, like a punchline for comedians, and his Republican opponents and, of course, his Democratic opponents really latched onto that and made it a big issue.
It is an annoying thing, I think, that somebody who is a good person, who has really done everything that you wish everybody would do. In other words, don't blame anybody for your hard times. Just take what you got and make the best of it. And yet we like to throw these people under the bus, especially if they're religious, especially if they have religious convictions.
Yes, yeah, and especially if it's not our religion. If it's if it's their religion, it's not ours.
That's true. Yeah.
It's and you know what the saddest part of it is? If he hadn't used that term, or if the media hadn't latched on that and made it such a big deal, he might have won the presidency. And you know what would have happened then? You know the terrible thing that would have happened then? We would have left Vietnam sooner than we did, and probably a few thousand young men might not have died in there.
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah, I was thinking
the same thing. And we wouldn't have suffered through Watergate. Watergate would not be a term.
He wouldn't have done that. Language. Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. Well, I never knew anything about him, to be honest with you. So your book is a real eye opener for me, and it kind of gives me a new sense of respect for Mitt. Believe it or not, I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but it does.
Oh, it does. Yeah.
When you know the man's wife, his father, his mother, all of a sudden you know the man better. You know, or the woman, depending. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You were honored with the Lee Iacocca Award for your automotive writing. Did George run in the same circles as Lee?
No, not really. They were a different generation. I think they probably had met a few times, but Lee Iacocca was more famous in the 60s, mid to late 60s, and then, of course, into the 70s, where George Romney was more in the 50s and early 60s. He left the automotive field in 62 to run for the governorship of Michigan, which he won. Which is another miracle. Michigan is a heavily Democratic state, and especially back then, the power of the UAW was incredible. And he ran as a Republican and won. And and he won by sheer hard work. I think he just worked harder than anybody else.
Wow,
it's a great term, sheer hard work. I love that.
Let me take a few phone calls if you're okay. This is a fascinating conversation. Patrick Foster is our guest. He wrote the book George Romney, An American Life. It is a biography about a man I never knew, the father of Mitt Romney, and it clearly shows some roots that I just never even knew could be traced from Mitt Romney. I always liked Mitt Romney, but I honestly never knew anything about his father. Let me see who I have here. Good morning. You're on the air. Thank you for calling. You're on with Patrick Foster.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I knew a lot of people that worked for American Motors, being a southern Wisconsin company, a large company at that time. In your opinion, what brought that company down?
Over the long haul?
Yes.
I think it was Japanese competition. Yeah, that, and then what finished it off was the recession in the early 1980s. They just didn't have enough capital to survive through that.
Did you think the unions had any situation involved with bringing it down too?
Well, the unions certainly didn't help. They were not very productive. They were not cooperative. And they did a lot of things that unions don't do nowadays. Things like overstaffing with shop stewards and throwing wildcat strikes for very little or no reason, keeping people on the job that should not have been on the job. It was a different era. They could get away with things like that back then.
All right. Thank you
very much.
Thank you for the call. I found your book on Amazon, and I did not realize today is the day. Today's the big release day.
Today is the big release day, yes.
Wow.
Like a birthday for me.
Well, yeah, it is. Was it different for you writing a biography compared to what you normally write?
Yes, because normally I write about a great number of people. When I write, when I say I'm an automotive historian, I write mostly about the businesses and the people who run them and the decisions they make and how those decisions affect the businesses. So to write just about one person and the people in his life, that was different. But again, you want to start with a story and keep the threads together so that at the very end of the story, everything comes together and people say, wow, now I understand.
Your book also shows, and I guess you've had other people comment this exact same thing, but it also shows how the press quite often has made up the minds of Americans, and they try to make Americans agree with them. In other words, if you're running for the president and the press agrees that you should be the president, then you've kind of got it made. In the case of Trump, it didn't work out that way, but in the case of George Romney, it seemed to go against him because the press was against him.
Yes, yeah. They made a joke of him because, as you said, he was a very religious person, and the press doesn't like religious people. I guess a lot of people don't like religious people.
Yeah, right.
You see politicians. You see politicians align themselves with Hollywood. What was his take on the Hollywood persona?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because his wife, the woman he married, was a Hollywood starlet. And,
right, yeah.
She was a simple Mormon girl that grew up in the same town that he lived in, in Salt Lake City, and they met in high school. And she always wanted to be an actress, and she went to college, and her father told her if she did well in college, she could go to acting school in New York. And so while poor George is trying to convince her to marry him, she takes off for New York City and goes to acting school. And she's in plays and everything, and ends up getting an offer to go to Hollywood. So she moves out to Hollywood. George is stuck in Washington, D.C. How do you win the heart of a girl who's on the other side of the country?
Yeah, really.
And she's in making movies with Clark Gable and people like that. And he's thinking, this is not turning out the way I wanted it to.
But think about that too. I mean, he was the kid living in an army tent, and he went to be the governor, and went on to be the candidate for president. So, I mean, if you can do that, you can find the girl of your dreams. I guess. I don't know. That's probably harder. Well, that's harder than getting to be the president, I think.
And the great thing is he had no money at all, and he's trying to figure out how am I going to get out there. So he somehow convinced his employer to transfer him to California. So he got out there on their dime.
Wow, my
and
gosh.
had a job out there, so he could concentrate on winning her. And it's a great love story because they, like all the great operas and great musical comedies. It was boy meets girl, boy wins girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl again.
Wow.
It was just that formula, and all the different times that they broke up and then made up, and they finally get married in the end, and it's happily ever after.
It's really a wonderful book. Let me take another phone call. The book again is called George Romney: An American Life. It's written by Patrick Foster, who is our guest. The foreword of the book, by the way, is written by Mitt Romney. Mm-hmm. Good morning. Thank you for calling and for holding. You're on the air with Patrick Foster.
Yeah. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah. Yeah, there were 4 small automobile companies that did 2 medium-sized mergers. Nash and Hudson became American Motors, and Studebaker and Packard became Studebaker-Packard. And then there was supposed to be another merger where the 2 was supposed to get together, and that never happened. That was why American Motors never quite got there.
Okay.
And that's why Studebaker-Packard went away.
Yes, yeah. I've always felt that if Packard had merged with Nash and Hudson, they would still be here today, and I think they would probably own Chrysler. Studebaker, I've always had I loved Studebaker cars, but as a company, it was financially inept and just bleeding money constantly. But Packard was a great company, and they had lots of money. They might have made it with that combination.
George, reading your book, George seems to be a very fair person and a very respectful person of others, and that's really to be commended.
Yeah, and I don't want to, and I didn't try to paint a picture of him as a goody two shoes. He could have a temper at time. He could he never swore that I knew of. I never met anybody but he could get a little hot under the collar. I know he got a little impatient with me a few times when I didn't quite understand the points he was making, but scrupulously fair with everybody. And I'll tell you, in all the dozens of people I interviewed, I never met one person who had anything bad to say about George Romney. They all said, he was some of these grown men, they were in their 80s, and they would talk about working for George Romney, and they would have tears in their eyes, saying he was just such a great guy.
Wow, that's fascinating. I have a copy of the book. I know it's an advanced copy, so it's kind of a collector's copy. If you want the one that was sent to us, you are welcome to it, but I only have one, so good luck to whoever calls in. The rest of us have to go buy it. Today's the big release date, so you can get it on Amazon. I saw it already on there. Do you have any other suggestions, any other websites?
Well, we've got my own website, which is OLDE, Milford Press. It features all my own books. I've written, 23 is the official count so far. I'm just finishing up on 24.
Wow.
They can get it there. They can get an autograph copy there, actually.
Wow.
Nice.
All right, we'll send people there.
Old Milford Press.
I got the phone ringing off the hook. I'm picking one at random here. George Romney is the book, and American Life is the subtitle, and Patrick Foster is the author. Good morning. You've got the book. Who's this?
Good morning. This is Kathy. What a fascinating story.
Thank you, Kathy. You've got the book.
Awesome. Might take a day or two for me to get there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Yes. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, we're still recovering from Hurricane Irma. I should have mentioned that to you, Patrick.
I think.
How's that going?
We're doing. We're making it. But we got a lot of help too. A lot of people coming to our town, linemen and tree cutters from out of state.
Yeah,
really
all over.
Fabulous. We're getting a lot of help. So that's the only reason we're pulling up out of this mess.
I think George and Mitt Romneys were probably impressed with you also, sir, because you have to have this good rapport to do a book of this magnitude.
Well, I know George told me that I was the first journalist he ever met that really understood the company and how he ran it. But I really admired him, and we got along pretty well. And Mitt, of course, is a terrific guy. He came through and did the forward for me, which I greatly appreciate.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for in educating me about somebody I never knew about, and kind of opens up my eyes a whole lot more about Mitt. And I wonder if this is going to be the beginning. I don't know. I wonder if this will assist in maybe getting Mitt to not apply for the presidency, re-campaign, whatever.
Yes.
To do it again, to try to do it again.
I'd like to see it. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
Yeah. Patrick, thank you for being on the air with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It was great.
It was fun. All right, we will take a break. We'll be right back. Here is your 30-second news brief. Marion County is partnering with community agencies to deliver water and food at 2 p.m. this afternoon to those in need following Hurricane Irma. The 3 locations are in Reddick, Citra, and Silver Springs. Call 438-2300 for addresses. A 25-year-old man is accused of slamming a gas station employee to the ground after he was told he couldn't cut in line to get gas. And state lawmakers are calling for a criminal investigation into the nursing home deaths in South Florida. And that is your news brief from The Source.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident. It is going to stay warm and humid today. We'll have sun mixed with clouds, and there'll be an afternoon thunderstorm. The high 86 to 90. Partly to mostly cloudy tonight, a low 73 to 78. And another afternoon thunderstorm tomorrow, especially inland.